it's got a variety of names. Bishop Spalding was the first one to mention it, and Bishop Martin J. Spalding wrote in 1844 in a book on Catholicism out here, and he called it the Catholic Colony. And then that was 1844. 1880s, two authors, Webb and Mays, I'll talk a little bit about them later, they just called it a league. And then Sister Mary Ramona Mattingly, she was a sister from Sisters of Nazareth, she called it the Maryland Colonization League. So she kind of combined what was already said. And she wrote about it in the 1830s. And then I'm writing now, some of you know I'm working on a book, and I'm writing now on this, trying to dig deeper than has been dug in the past. And so I gave it the name Maryland Catholic League. So that's really my name. You won't see that officially anywhere else. And I thought I would just do a little intro. Some of this is kind of an intro to the book, which isn't out yet, and it probably won't be out for about another year. But the league points of interest. So why would they want to leave Maryland? It seems like a nice place to live. They've got the shore there. They love their seafood and their shellfish. And then why, if you're going to leave Maryland, and why do you choose Kentucky? I think, Michael, you kind of hinted at that already. Yeah. And then who gets to go? And how do you get there from here? And then who signed on the dotted line? So this league was a voluntary thing, and Basil Hayden, some call him Basil Hayden. Basil Hayden was supposedly the ringleader of this, who got this together and basically said, hey, let's get a bunch of people to make an agreement about this. And so we'll talk just a little bit more about that, about more of the details of that later. But number one, why would they leave Maryland? First of all, I'd like to back up just a bit on that and talk about the Ark and the Dove. Now, these were the Mayflower boats plural in this case, that founded the Maryland colony. So the Ark was the much larger one, and the Dove was the smaller one. They left in late 1633 and arrived in Maryland in early 1634. They got split up along the way in a storm. I know the Ark thought the Dove had gone down in the storm, and probably vice versa. And they ended up running into each other later in the West Indies somewhere. And like, oh, you're alive. I thought, they'd probably been praying for their souls since the storm. But they ended up landing, getting back up from the West Indies up to Maryland, and that's where St. Mary's County got its start, and that's the foundation of the state of Maryland, is St. Mary's County. And so they've got a good thing going, but they're deciding to leave. So that was 1830s, and then we jump ahead to the 1780s, and there have been a number of writers who have written about why would they leave, and these are the most common reasons given right here. And I don't know, maybe number 2 and 3 there, you might combine them, but they are different. Religious persecution is one that's thrown out there a lot. I would beg to differ with that. There was religious persecution in Maryland. It was founded, as you probably all know, as the Catholic colony. Those who went on the Ark and the Dove were more Protestants than Catholics, by the way. There were quite a few Protestants on that, and they were very open to that. And you hear them talk about religious freedom, and Maryland being the place where that got started, and it's true. That group of the Calverts was the family name, but it was Lord Baltimore, and their family name was Calvert. They were very clear about that hey, Protestants are welcome. We are not going to do any kind of persecution, even though this is kind of a Catholic thing. They're welcome, and they can come along. And it went bad after a number of years, and what ended up happening was there was basically a revolution who kicked out the Lord Baltimore and basically took over. And they were really, you can call them Puritans, who ended up running the colony, and then they persecuted the Catholics. And so from about the 90s up until the Revolutionary War, Catholics were persecuted and they had to pay taxes to the Church of England in Maryland, and they weren't, plus to support their own people, but they weren't allowed to have public church service. They couldn't build churches or chapels. It had to be done in a house or some building on private property. Not unlike here, where they were doing mass in homes before they built the first church. They were doing it for a different reason here. They weren't being persecuted. But there's a lot of talk about that. Hey, they wanted to get away from that religious persecution, which had gone on for some time. But at the same time, hey, they had just won the Revolutionary War. Things were looking up. Things were looking different. Maybe there was a chance that the religious persecution was going to end. It did. We know that historically. So that one's given. But lack of affordable land, land out here was much cheaper. That's a given. Soil exhaustion, you know, the tobacco just kills the soil, you know that. They didn't know how to nourish the soil. Property taxes were going up. And the economy after the Revolutionary War was we were in pretty bad shape in this country. England had really done us harm. And so maybe they thought, hey, maybe we could just make it better out there with the land. Personally, for me, it's number two. I think they came out economic reasons. Land was cheap. There was land, and so this last point, you hear it every now and then, but really the war was over. But Maryland had suffered a lot. All the 13 colonies, they all suffered. But the Chesapeake Bay, the British ships were going up and down there and would just land on shore and just go through homes and just take whatever. Those were hard times. So in my research, those were some of the spellings I saw of the state. And the last one I like, Kane, Kentucky, two separate words. That was done by a Jarbo man, Stephen Jarbo, who wrote his will. He actually was out here very early. He had a warrant, military warrant for land, did what he needed to do, and then went back to St. Mary's County and died. And so he wrote a will before he died, and this is how he spelled Kentucky. But this is similar. You had a map. This is maybe a little more focused. But why did they come to Kentucky? Michael said it was the first. It was the first place that the West opened up. Kentucky's the 15th state. Vermont was 14th. People kind of forget, you know, Vermont right there was the 14th state, and there was a land dispute between New Hampshire and New York, I think, over who owned it. So they snuck in a year before us. But so you could see Virginia being Jamestown, the earliest colony. They claimed all this land because it was very vague when those charters were made by England. You know, they knew the coast, but they just kind of said, you know, that way. And I don't even know if they really knew about how much they knew about the Mississippi. But you could see that's claimed by Virginia. Even up here, look at this, Michigan, Wisconsin, part of Minnesota claimed by Virginia. This one, Massachusetts and Virginia, and then Connecticut and Virginia. Even this part of Pennsylvania, where Pittsburgh is claimed by Pennsylvania and Virginia. So Virginia really had their claws out there claiming a lot of land. But you can see this is most of Ohio, most of Indiana, most of Illinois right there. And so in the upper part of those states were, you know, partly claimed by Virginia. So they owned a lot of land. They ended up, the federal government kind of pushed them, and they ended up giving in this northern land so that they can use it they had to pay the Revolutionary War soldiers. And so they, with military warrants, and that's a whole nother conversation about how land was acquired through different warrants. But the federal government says, hey, we got to pay our soldiers back who served in the Revolutionary War. We need that land. So, so you could see here, so West Virginia, and then down here, of course, is Kentucky. You can see Louisville. And so what happened with the Maryland folks, Maryland didn't have a lot of land. You don't see Maryland listed anywhere out here. They've just got, you know, this green stuff. So right here in western Maryland, the Maryland Revolutionary War soldiers were given 50 acres of land. Well, if you fought for Virginia, out of Virginia in the Revolutionary War, you got more, you got 100 acres or 500 acres, or depending on your level of seniority in the military. So there were Maryland folks from St. Mary's County who jumped down to Virginia, and I don't know if they were living there or if they knew, hey, we'll have better benefits if we go fight out of the Virginia regiments. So just to let you see here, this is southern Maryland right here where St. Mary's County is. In Charles County is right next door, and then just north of that, really just touching where DC is today, was Prince George's County. Those are the three Catholic counties. Like we have the three Catholic counties here, those were the three Catholic counties in Maryland. Early on, there was some conversation, and I found a source that I've since lost, and I need it for my book, but there was an article written about how there were some negotiations. They were thinking of going from Maryland over here. You could see here to Spanish possession. See, that's what later became the Louisiana Purchase, right? On that side of the Mississippi River. It was French. They lost to the British up there in Quebec in 1764, maybe a little later. And they quickly sold that over, or handed it over to Spain so that the British wouldn't get it. And so there was talk before 1785 with some Catholics going over to Spanish Catholic territory and living there, but it would have been outside of the United States. And so there was a little talk of that, and then later, some of those Catholics who went out to Missouri and places out that way were actually making deals with Spanish people, and the Spanish governors were trying to steal the priests. They tried to get Madden and not Narings, he was later, but they tried to buy out some of the early priests and offer them really nice wages to go out there and tend to the Catholics who were out there and pay them really, really a lot of money compared to what they were getting in Kentucky, which was basically nothing. And but they decided not to do it. One or two of them actually did sneak out over there and go into Spanish territory. So let's go to the next screen now. Benjamin Webb, I've got his book here. Maybe you've heard of this, The Centenary of Catholicity in Kentucky. So that means 100 years later. So he wrote this in 1884, so really 99 years after that group went. And on page 27, he wrote this. In the year 1785, a league, there's the word of 60 families, was formed in Maryland, all Catholics and mostly residents of St. Mary's County, each of whom was pledged to immigrate to Kentucky within a specified time. The purpose was to settle together, mutual protection from the natives, and with the view of securing to themselves with the least possible delay, that was important, the advantages of a pastorate and a church. And that ended up becoming Holy Cross Church, which was called Sacred Heart Chapel when it was first built. They were not all to immigrate at once, but as circumstances permitted. So there was some kind of contract, and he gets into it with that word tradition. The tradition of this league is sufficiently general among old people, as well as in Maryland, as in Kentucky, to give it certainty. So the old timers in both states, he said, were talking about this as if it was just a given. Everyone knew it was the truth. There's no document left behind to give us any insight as to, did they sign it? Was this an oral thing? Did it even really exist this way? Nothing. This is all we have, and here we are, 100 years later. Of the 60 families subscribing to the compact, 25 left Maryland early in '85 and reached Kentucky before the end of spring. So they went up to Pittsburgh and then flatboat down to Maysville, which is Mason County. So that's kind of the bulk. Anyone talking about this league is going to reference this paragraph on page 27 of this book. This is a great book, and it's available digitally if you you ever want to see it, because the originals are hard to get. So that's kind of the foundation of the league. I've underlined a few things just to talk about. All Catholics. Yeah. Now, the book's not out, but I'm going to give you a little early insight here. I'm at this point in my research, there are going to be a couple non-Catholics. They're just like the Ark and the Dove, and just like St. Joseph's Proto-Cathedral here, as some of you know, that a good deal of the money that went toward that was given by Protestants. Catholics didn't have a lot, and it might even be that there were more Protestants as Catholics. I forget the details on that. Dixie Hibbs would know this on that, but this is going to be a surprise when I print this, that it looks like there were some non-Catholics among the groups that came out. And then St. Mary's County, so St. Mary's County, that's true from my research. They were mostly from St. Mary's County, but some from those other two. Charles County, which is right next door, and then next to that, closer to DC, is Prince George's County. And then a few stragglers from a few other counties, Frederick and some other counties. And there were other Catholics, that I might point out, there were other Catholics who showed up there who were not from Maryland. Anyone here have Ballard genealogy up their line? Now, the first one was the famous Proctor Ballard, and he actually wasn't Catholic. He came from Pennsylvania, but apparently somebody who knows the Ballards really well. He married, he had two wives, I guess one died. I think they were both Catholic, and all the kids were Catholic, and they've been basically Catholic ever since. So Webb wrote, and his, I underline that word tradition because his book really is a kind of more tradition and oral history than raw research. He says a number of things like, I don't know this or I don't know that, but those are documents which were available in 1884 in the county clerk's offices. He could have gone to do that. He did not do research like we would today, like let's just jump in and get all the documents we possibly can, go through all the archives, find everything that's been written about this, how we could do that today. I had mentioned that Sister Mattingly, the Sister of Nazareth, she wrote in 1936. She kind of by that time, finally, she wrote a really well-written book on this topic. And I still get impressed with how much documentation she got a hold of, and footnoted everything. So it just took a while for us as far as how we do research. So his oral tradition is what's out there. Mostly it's oral tradition. And then he claims the right that there were 60 families, and the compact, and then 25 left Maryland early in 1785. This is kind of my little personal thing. If you go to the Holy Cross Cemetery, there's that historical sign. It's right next to the road. If you're traveling south, it's right next to the road there in the cemetery, and it basically says Basil. It says Catholic Pioneers, I think, is the title of that. I should have a picture of it up here, but it says Basil Hayden led 25 families, and it wasn't 25. Father Baden wrote the original document around 1820, and he said about 20, and then Father Mays, Camillus Mays, who wrote in 1780. For whatever reason, he decided to change the number to 25. He doesn't say why, but he went from 20 to 25. And 4 years later, Webb wrote and took his number, and it's been 25 ever since. And anywhere you look it up on the internet, search it, they always say 25, but it wasn't 25. It was 20. And the Baden said about 20 in French. It was a document he wrote in Paris, about 20, and somehow that got written as 25. In my research, I don't even have 20. I think I have 15 or 17. So I guess either one of those, 25 or 15, is about 20. So, and they did, Pittsburgh, and then flatboat down to Maysville, and then they got off at Maysville because it would have been easier to go to Louisville, but that stretch of land stretch of the river from Maysville, the basically up to Cincinnati and back. I should do it for you guys. Up to Cincinnati and back down to Louisville there were a lot of Indian attacks, and so it was easier to get off at Maysville and travel to, I think it's 100 miles or so, maybe a little more, on land. So they had to go land from Maryland up to so you're going from there's St. Charles, here's St. Mary's is right here. That little loop, that little curve in the Potomac there is St. Charles, so St. Mary's is here, and Prince George's is there. So they basically went up this way and then had to cross the various Appalachian ridges on that map you had. You can see all those little ridges. They had to cross them, and each one of them was hell. It was just really hard on the wagons. They would have to repair their wagons, the wheels. Sometimes they lost an axle, but they brought this stuff to fix it. And then 2 ridges later, they had to do it again. Bishop Flagey, when he came out, they were in a carriage. Actually, he wasn't in it at the time, but it hit something and it tipped over. There was a seminarian inside. The rest were either on horseback or walking at that point. And the seminarian was fine, but that was really common. Those hills going over the Appalachians or Alleghenies, they might be called by some, was really hard. So that was a really long stretch. You imagine from here up to about here is where the mountains end, and then right where that river begins, that's the Ohio. Right there is Pittsburgh. Right there, the start of the flatboat trip. And now some of them went to other places, not just Pittsburgh. Some of them started at Redstone Fort, which is called Brownsville today, in different places, a little further up, and then they would drop down to Pittsburgh and then go from there. I read there are a lot of really good journals, really fascinating journals on diaries on the trip, about what people wrote about the trip. And I've tried to get as many as I can. I've read at least 20 of them. And the only Catholic one was a guy named Philip Lee, whose diary is missing, unfortunately. He was one of those out in 1785. He was on the first group. And his diary, Webb talks about it. He had it in his hand and he talked about it. And unfortunately, he should have quoted the whole thing in here. He did not. And then by the 1930s, it was missing. And it's been missing ever since, so we don't know what happened to it. If someone has it in their archives at home, please give me a call. So they would get on flatboats, and typically they would have 2 families per flatboat, and they would head down the Ohio, and they just float. These aren't boats that can go upstream or whatever. They just float. They go with the current. That's their power, and they'd have those big sweeping steering poles. I don't know if you want to call them rudders or kills, but that's really all they had, and they just floated. And they floated often during the night down the Ohio. They would just float at night unless the weather was bad or windy. They would just go at night and hope they didn't hit a tree sticking up out of the water or something. They wouldn't do that on the Mississippi when they went down to, if they ever went down to New Orleans. The Mississippi was notorious for having trees just stuck to the bottom of the bed of the river and sticking up about a foot below the water line, and you couldn't see it when they hit them. But these flatboats were huge. They'd have their carts on it, the carriages, their horse-drawn carriages. They'd have horses. In my book, I have like the statistics on how many horses per boat or per person, and how many wagons, and how many cows, and how many people per boat. And it was typically about 20 people per flatboat, typically 2 families. And they would just go all the way down to Maysville, which is somewhere around here, and then they would get off. And if they had a wagon, they would lift it off, they'd take it out and kind of put it back together. They disassembled it at Pittsburgh, and they'd reassemble it, hook up some horses, and load all the heavy stuff on that, and they would be on their way. But they mostly walked, probably from Maysville, so you're talking, you're coming down to Lexington and then cutting across Danville to the Bardstown area. Any questions?
Dip in the river right below the letter I in river.
Are you referring to this right here?
you know, where it says river.
Oh,
Drop straight down that's Maysville.
right there. Am I close? See how steady that hand is?
You know,
About right here?
that's it.
Yeah, okay, so that's Maysville, thank you. Yeah, it was called Limestone, all the early writers called it Limestone, but it changed.
Washington was the state capital for a while, right there, just
Up the hill, yeah, the town of Washington.
Was that the capital in 18, when they were starting to make this?
Well, you know, at this point, there's no Kentucky yet, right? So it's Richmond, Virginia is the capital, right? So Kentucky was part of Virginia until statehood at that time. Yeah. So yeah, and that was apparently the river. It probably still is quite beautiful to float down, and but a little bit dangerous even with the Indians. One of the groups 2 years in, 1787, decided to go past Maysville, and they came down here just 18 miles shy of Louisville, which is where they were headed. They got attacked by Indians, one of the Catholic groups. And then the other route here, the other option is to go to the Cumberland Gap. And let me see if I can get. So you had to cross Virginia and come down, around here, I guess, and come in and work your way up. I did the mileage on that. I think it's 100 miles more of overland route if you go that way, versus getting to Pittsburgh. But of course, you still got all those miles on the river, but those are kind of easier than, apparently, you know, the more you had on land, the tougher it was on wagons and horses and kids.
Were the two routes used simultaneously, or the first 25 families came down the river? And
Well,
later routes
according to that quote on page 27, they went down the river. In my research, I didn't find anyone who went through Cumberland Gap from Maryland. There was one guy, his name was Joseph Mattingly, who claimed he met a friend of Daniel Boone who kind of talked him into this, hey, you got to go through Cumberland Gap, and supposedly he did. There's no real documentation. It was kind of word of mouth or something that he did go through there. But if you were, you know, down here in Virginia or North Carolina, that would make sense. But if you're up here, it just seemed like they went that way. There was one Baptist preacher, his journal I just read last week, he was down in this area, right around Norfolk, Virginia, maybe just across the border into North Carolina. And he didn't go to Cumberland. He went up to Pittsburgh, which was surprising to me that far down there that he went that way. But it was a month. It was a 1 month journey. So that's quite the haul. Bishop Carroll, who was the Bishop of Baltimore, he until 1810 or so, when Bishop Flagey started, he had promised Father Baden he would come to Kentucky, because that was part of his diocese, and bishops are supposed to go visit their people. And but he apparently didn't like travel, even when it was a little more comfortable. This would not have been, and he never got down there. So, all right, let's go to the next. Any questions on the map?
the first 25 was, Lasso Hayden was the organizer or the leader of the group?
I have not found anything in my research that would prove otherwise. That's one point where I had to kind of rely on the tradition, and it's a pretty deep tradition, that he led that first group.
He was referred to by some group as Old Granddad.
Right. Well, that goes back to the bourbon.
And the Old Granddad bourbon was to his.
Right, and supposedly that little image on that, it was developed by his grandson, and he put the image on the label. Supposedly that was the image of his grandfather. So when you look at, if you see a bottle of bourbon, Old Granddad, there's a little face. That's supposedly Basil Hayden, and so I write a little bit about his bourbon history in the book. I was able to extract just a little bit on him. He did produce bourbon. Yeah, that wasn't a myth. So, and then this is, so the book I'm writing focuses on the Tri-County here, Nelson, Washington, Marion. And until 1792, it was all just Nelson. There were no other counties there in this area. 1792, statehood, and immediately Washington County was created. It included Marion County, and in 1834, Marion County broke off from Washington County. But really, up until this point here, it was all Nelson County. So there was no, what county are you in? And so on my book, I decided to cover the Catholics who got here by statehood, and I include the whole year of 1792. And I mostly use tax records, but there's plenty of other court records and other land records, other records that I was able to look at to supplement the tax records. So this is currently, these are the numbers I have. These numbers will change. I was looking back over my history. Every few months I take a snapshot of my numbers and I save them so I can kind of look at the progression. And they've gone up and down. When the book's published, it will not have these numbers. Guaranteed some of these will be different. But it's kind of a work in progress, so those numbers change. But I said, you're thinking, hey, he told us he didn't even have 20. Really, that 20 includes a few Catholics who didn't come from Maryland. And so, but these are just Catholics. That's all this. I just extracted these numbers. I didn't go say who was from Maryland and who wasn't for the sake of this slideshow. So 20 the first year, and you remember the number that they said, signed that, signed, whatever, made that contract? How many were going to come out within a few years?
60.
It was 60. It was 60. And so if you look at the running totals, by 1786, they've met that number. So Webb wrote, within a certain time period, they had signed to come out. If my numbers are correct, I guess that number was 2. I'm guessing, right? 62 were out here, 20 plus 42, 62. And then this is the accumulation of all these numbers each year. So I think the last time I spoke here, I said something like 365, I was telling those folks. And the difference here is that what I don't have on this screen is there were about 20 people here, Catholics, 15 to 20, 15 I think it is, who were here prior to 1785 that aren't on this list. I didn't put them on here. And
What's the significance of the asterisk?
I'm sorry?
The asterisk?
The asterisk, okay, 60, I put the asterisk, thanks for asking. I put the asterisk on that because that if, I'm calling this talk the Catholic League, right? The Maryland Catholic League. Well, really the League was only those who said, we will go by a certain period of time, according to Webb. We will be there. And so really, technically, the League ended right there. So everything below this line, is kind of extra. They didn't make an agreement, in theory, right? So, and the other thing is that if you look at these numbers, you'd say, hey, what happened to 1788? That must have been a banner year. Why did so many people show up all of a sudden? And what happened here is that my research is saying that there was a second group that came out. In 1785, there was one group. In 1786, there was another group. In 1787, 2 groups came out, one in the spring and one in the fall. And so the ones who showed up in the fall wouldn't show up in the tax records, which are taken, say, in the summer. You won't see them till the following year. So it looks like they showed up in 1788 when some of these 60 were actually here in the year before, but I don't have any way of knowing who they were. I only know one who showed up earlier. And so I put him in 1787 because I have proof he got here in the fall. And so going down the Ohio, you don't go in the summer, and generally you don't go in the winter. You're either spring or fall, and it has to do with the river levels. It gets too low. The Lewis and Clark expedition suffered from this. they started too late, and they kept hitting bottom, and they had all those boats, and they were loaded down with equipment, and they kept getting stuck on the upper Ohio, and it was just a real tough deal. And a lot of these journals write about this, that there were people that had to wait for a month and a half, 2 months, waiting for the water level to get high enough so that their boats would be able to get downriver. Any other asterisks? Okay, and then over here, I got cut off here a little bit. In fact, I didn't notice that got the margins on these columns got messed up. No big deal. You can see the name. The only one missing, you can see that Willett down there. So these are the surnames of the earliest arrivals that I have found in what was then Nelson County. Any of you have any of those names on your? You know your ancestry.
The Donahue Valley.
Okay, yeah, the Donahue, that one actually surprised me, that was on there, yeah. And then George Hart was the doctor, you maybe read a little bit about him. He and William Coombs, right above him, those two actually came out to Kentucky in 1775. They were at Harrodsburg. They were at the original fort, and Hart was a doctor, and the claim is that this Catholic was the first doctor in the state, period. He was the first doctor in Kentucky. And then Mr. Coombs, William Coombs, his wife Jane, was the one who opened that school in the fort. She was teaching the kids, and she's the first teacher in the state. With the first school that she set it up, she also is claimed to be the first person who reducted, salt out of the water. And so those two Catholics were were important, and something that Catholics, I think, have a little feather in their cap about, that the first teacher and doctor were Catholics. Now they ended up coming out here. I've just recently done some research on the land of Coombs and Hart. They both had land just north of where we are right now. Hart was basically straight north of us, and Coombs was kind of heading out a little bit toward the bypass up there, where BJ's Steakhouse is, if you know, in what's that store? Save-A-Lot, working up that way. Coombs had land there, and the southern point of their land touched right near Wickland Manor, the house of the three governors, right, like literally in the driveway of that place. It appears as where their two properties met, but they each had 1,400 acres, so it was quite a bit of land working north of here. So, and Hart had the land that is the cemetery today. In fact, that's where the first St. Joe's little chapel was. It was there, and it was a horrible little building with the water and the wind coming in. They couldn't even do mass in it. And Bishop Flasley showed up, and he says, "This is my cathedral. This horrible, wretched place. This is it." Because if you're a bishop, you got to have a cathedral in your hometown, which was Bardstown. So, any questions on this?
Did they lose many people during the trip? You heard of them?
Well, the Hayden family lost, I know for sure 3, they typically say 4. Basil Hayden, when he came out, lost 4 of his family members, died. It doesn't say how they died, but they were all kids. Is that what you're asking? That was what you mean by lost? And then the Philip Miles and Thomas Hill, the Miles and the Hills families shared a flatboat, and that's explained, I think, in here. Maybe it's in Spalding's book. When they got shot at, they were the group that went past Maysville. They took the risk in 1787, and they were almost 18 miles from Louisville, and they got shot at. They lost all their horses. More importantly, they had a kid. He was actually a slave, and he must have been up on deck, steering up on top, and he was shot and killed. And Thomas Hill himself, who really ended up out in the Cartwright's Creek settlement, he got a bullet that went through both of his legs. So he must have been up on top as well, because the people who, in the flatboats, they had thick sides specifically to stop bullets. And all the people were down in there, and they were safe. And but the folks up on top, one of Thomas Hill's sons, I think his name was Clement, was lying down up on top. I don't know, he was sunbathing. He was lying down up on top, and he did not get hit. But the slave guy, his name was Hall, was shot, killed, and fell on this son of Thomas Hill, Clement Hill. So just a tragic thing. And they came to Bardstown and had to stay here for a year while Thomas Hill recovered. He married Philip Miles' sister. That's why those two families were on this, they shared a flatboat. So pretty tragic.
Do you know who attacked that flatboat? Was it the Shawnee?
Most likely, they were the most common groups. You know, it's kind of hard to discern. They didn't really know. You know, they weren't experts. They couldn't tell by looking at them what kind they were. But the Shawnee were, north of here and just across the Ohio.